Wonderful. Well, it is certainly good to see everybody. It's been, I think, 3 months since I last joined you. I think it was the end of October that I was last on this call. So it has been a while. And as you likely have seen from the announcement for this session, I've entitled this teaching The Overview of the Biblical Feasts. And perhaps it would, and this will become more clear in the teaching over the next few minutes, perhaps I should have entitled it An Overview of the Lord's Feasts, because these are actually feasts that the Lord identified as his own. And just to kind of lay the groundwork here and give a little setup for what's coming, I would really like for this teaching to be introductory, in the sense that I would like to lay the groundwork for a series of lessons that I would like to do for this calendar year of 2026. You may already be aware of this, but when we talk about the Lord's feasts, we're specifically referring to the feasts that are described. There are three places primarily in the Old Testament where these feasts are described. They are described most fully in the book of Leviticus, in chapter 23. They also, just for your information, you can also read about some of these feasts in the book of Numbers, specifically in chapters 28 and 29. And then also the book of Deuteronomy in chapter 16 includes some information about these feasts. So again, the three primary places where these feasts are described are, again, fully in Leviticus chapter 23, and then also Numbers chapters 28 and 29, and the book of Deuteronomy in chapter 16. But what I would like to do is just, again, lay the groundwork here, give some background information, review, maybe just for a little while, what I taught last fall. You may recall I did a series entitled Finding Jesus in the Old Testament. So I'd like to review that just for a few minutes, since it's been, again, 3 months since we last met. But then again, also, and you've probably already figured out where I'm going on this, these biblical feasts, or the Lord's feasts, of which there are 7, all point to Jesus as the Messiah. Just as we discussed and hopefully made clear back in the fall, the entire Bible is about Jesus, including the Old Testament. The Old Testament points to Jesus. He may not be explicitly referenced or identified as such in the Old Testament, like he obviously is in the New Testament, but he is certainly pictured or foreshadowed in the Old Testament. So getting back to this series of lessons, what I would like to do is for this to be an introductory teaching. And then moving forward throughout the year 2026, I would like to take each of the 7 feasts in order and do a deep dive, really dig into the meaning and significance of each of these feasts. And just to be clear, and I'll repeat this probably numerous times in today's teaching and in the teachings to come throughout this year, these are the feasts. You're probably already familiar with many, if not most of these, but what we're talking about here are the 7 feasts that God gave instructions to the Israelites through Moses around 1,500 years before Jesus was born, before Jesus was made incarnate and walked this earth. Specifically, when God and through Moses led the Hebrews out of Egypt, God gave very clear instructions that there were 7 feasts that the Israelites were to observe in each year. And I'll just list them in their order of observance and in sequential order. These are the feasts of Passover. That's the first one. Secondly, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Third, the Day of First Fruits. Fourth, the Day of Pentecost, which probably everyone is familiar with. Fifth, the Feast of Trumpets. Sixth, the Day of Atonement. And finally, seventh, the Feast of Tabernacles. So again, we're talking about Passover, unleavened bread, first fruits, Pentecost, trumpets, atonement, and tabernacles. Before we get into the teaching, I did, in case anyone has this question, I wanted to just clarify that the Bible makes it very clear through the words of God himself that these are not simply Jewish feasts. I think there's a misunderstanding among many modern day Christians that these 7 feasts, again, Passover, unleavened bread, Pentecost, etc., were just for the Jewish people, that they don't really have any meaning or import or significance for our lives as 21st century followers of Christ. However, I wanted to start in Leviticus 23. I wanted to just reference real quickly verse 2. There are certainly other verses I could read and point to, but in Leviticus 23:2, God makes it very clear that these are his feasts. And it says in Leviticus 23:2, these are my appointed feasts, the appointed feasts of the Lord, which you are to proclaim as sacred assemblies. And we're going to spend time here, probably in about 20 or so minutes, looking at the Hebrew words for feasts and sacred assemblies. But just at the outset, I wanted to emphasize that these are not feasts that were exclusively for the Jewish people. To go a little deeper, what I mean is because of the fact, or just because of the fact that Jesus has now come, he's lived, he was crucified, he was buried, he was resurrected, he was exalted and glorified to the throne of God. Now he sits at the right hand of God, interceding on our behalf. That does not make these feasts invalid. Okay, it doesn't mean that they are, to use a legal phrase, null and void. These are the Lord's feasts. Okay, they're for all of us. Yes, they were for the Jewish people, obviously, and there were great reasons for that, which I will enumerate over the next few minutes. However, I just wanted to lay the groundwork and say that there's much value to reading about, studying these feasts, because they all point to Jesus. And moving beyond that, they each have significance for us, again, even as followers of Christ, 2,000 plus years after Jesus walked this earth, in that they very clearly teach us steps that we can take as we become more spiritually mature in our walk with Christ. Everything is very, I think everybody knows this, but everything in the Bible is in its proper sequence. Okay, God didn't make any mistakes in the Bible that we have. Everything is orderly. Everything is sequenced precisely the way that he would have it be so. And so, again, just right here at the outset, I wanted to emphasize that these feasts are still very much applicable even to us as 21st century followers of Christ. Now, going a little deeper, the question may become, are we required to observe these feasts? Now, the Israelites clearly were required to observe these feasts. God made that very clear. You may know from reading the Old Testament that Jewish males were actually required to travel to Jerusalem 3 times a year. Even though there are 7 feasts, those were arranged or broken down into 3 feast seasons. And those 3 feast seasons were Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles. Okay, meaning there were 3 specific times of the year that the Jewish males were required to travel to Jerusalem to celebrate these feasts. It's worth noting, and this is probably obvious, that Jesus observed these feasts as well. So the question may arise, are we required as, again, 21st century followers of Christ to observe these feasts? And my answer to that is no. I don't see anywhere in the Bible that we are required to observe these feasts the way that the Israelites were required to do so. However, I can think of probably 8 or 9 benefits to not necessarily our observing these feasts, although I think, I know that many people have Passover meals, even to this day. Even Christians, observe from time to time Passover meals. They observe the Seder, for example. I think there's much benefit. There are many, many benefits to reading, studying, learning about these feasts, and maybe even to observing these feasts. I'll just name a few of the benefits that come to mind. One is that learning about these feasts, studying them, gives us a better understanding of the Bible as a whole. Okay, as I pointed out in the fall teaching, the entire Bible is about Jesus, and we have to take the whole counsel of God. We can't just focus on or isolate, one particular verse or a particular passage or even a particular book of the Bible. Everything has to be read in context. Everything has to be studied as a whole. So I think a study of these feasts will give us a better understanding of the Bible. The second benefit that I can think of is that it helps us to rediscover the Jewish roots of Christianity. Okay, I think, over the centuries, it's been lost, unfortunately, on many people, the Hebraic or the Jewish roots of Christianity. If you think about it, nearly the entire Bible was written by Jews. Okay, there are a couple of exceptions. The book of Luke, the book of Acts, possibly, if not probably the book of Mark. Those were authored by Gentiles. But, beyond those select books, of the 66 books of the Bible, the Bible was written by Jews. We know that Jesus was a Jew. We know John 4:22 tells us that salvation is from the Jews. Okay, so contrary to what some people think, the Jews weren't grafted into the Christians. We were grafted into them. Romans 11 makes this very clear that we've been grafted in. Okay, we've been grafted in. Christianity did not originate with us, meaning Gentiles. It originated with the Jews. Also, another benefit of studying these feasts is it gives us a fuller comprehension of God's plan of redemption. Okay, again, the feasts are ordered the way they are, very meticulously, very intentionally on the part of God, and they all point to Jesus. And what I mean by that is Jesus actually is the personal embodiment or the spiritual reality of each of these 7 feasts. To be more specific, Jesus has literally already fulfilled what I'll refer to as the spring feasts. That would be Passover, unleavened bread, first fruits, and Pentecost. He has already literally fulfilled, and we'll study these in much more detail, in the lessons to come throughout this series, throughout the year of 2026. Jesus will literally fulfill the fall feasts upon his return. And those are the feasts of trumpets, atonement, and tabernacles. So another benefit of this is, as I study the feast, it gives me a renewed passion for Jesus. Okay, because again, the entire Old Testament points to Jesus, and these 7 feasts specifically point to Jesus. He's the ultimate, another way of saying it is, Jesus is the ultimate fulfillment of each of these 7 feasts. Another benefit to studying the feasts is that it gives us greater insight into God's prophetic seasons. Okay, each of these 7 feasts has tremendous prophetic implications as well. It also, and it's not the subject of today's teaching, maybe one of the teachings I'll talk about, it gives us a greater understanding of the biblical church calendar or the Jewish calendar. Again, you probably know that these feasts were designated to be celebrated on certain days, and the Jewish calendar looks very different from our calendar. Again, that's a topic for a whole nother set of teachings, but it gives us a better understanding of the biblical calendar. Also, another benefit that has come to me is that it renews our love for the Jewish people, and it gives us a better understanding of the role of Israel in biblical prophecy and even in current events. So, just to review real quickly, and then I'll move on talking about the feasts in particular. The entire Old Testament is about Jesus. We looked in the fall at the fact that even though Jesus may not be explicitly referenced or identified in the Old Testament, he's certainly there. He's there on every page. We looked at so many things. First off, we looked at how the first explicit really reference to the Messiah is found in Genesis chapter 3, specifically Genesis 3, verse 15, where God is talking to the serpent in the Garden of Eden, and he tells the serpent, he will crush your head and you will strike his heel. Okay, that's a direct reference to the Messiah. When he talks to the serpent about striking his heel, what that refers to are the numerous attempts by Satan to destroy Jesus while he was here walking this earth. And when he says you will strike, you will crush his head, that's foreshadowing Jesus' triumph over sin, Jesus' triumph over Satan at his resurrection. So we see even way back in Genesis 3, 15, the explicit reference to Jesus. Just as a teaser here in a few minutes, I'll talk about how the feasts are referenced even in Genesis chapter 1. Okay, so the point I'm trying to make is this is nothing in the Bible is put in there in a haphazard or random way. This is all very meticulously planned by God, and thankfully there's an order to it. If you study it, you see that there's definitely an order. 1 Corinthians 14, verse 33 tells us that God is not a God of disorder, but of peace. And we see that the more we study the Bible, the more we get into the scriptures and really dig into them, we see that that there's an order to everything. So we looked in the teachings in the fall of last year that Jesus is pictured or portrayed or revealed in a number of ways in the Old Testament. We looked specifically at 3 things. We looked at types, shadows, and prophecy. And in the interest of time, I won't go back because I know I want to get on to the significance of the biblical feasts. So I won't go back and review all of those. But if you would like to go back and take a look at those videos, I'm sure they're still available. But we looked at how Jesus is foreshadowed in the Bible. We looked at types. For example, we saw different types of Jesus in the Bible, like Abel was a type of Christ. Noah was a type of Christ. Moses was a type of Christ. We spent considerable time looking at Genesis chapter 22, when Abraham was instructed by God to sacrifice Isaac on Mount Moriah. We looked at the ram in the thicket, okay, the ram in the bush, and we saw how that represented or foreshadowed Jesus being the whole concept of substitutionary atonement. In other words, God provided the ram to be sacrificed instead of Isaac. Okay, that was a foreshadowing of how Christ is our substitute, that instead of our paying the penalty for our sins, instead of our bearing the wrath of God for our sins, he directed his wrath toward Jesus. Okay, so we looked at different types. Just some others off the top of my head. We looked at the bronze serpent on the pole. Okay, that comes from the book of Numbers, chapter 21. Jesus explicitly references this in John chapter 3. Okay, this is where God instructed Moses to put the bronze serpent on the pole so that if any of the people were bitten by venomous snakes, they could look to the bronze serpent on the pole and be healed. We looked at prophecies like out of Isaiah chapter 7, Isaiah chapter 9, Isaiah chapter 53. We looked at Micah 5:2, Zechariah 9:9. We looked at the whole system of sacrifices and offerings, and we talked about how the entire sacrificial system. What we're talking about here are things like sin offerings, burnt offerings, guilt offerings, fellowship offerings, drink offerings, grain offerings. All of those things foreshadowed Jesus. Okay, we know that those things could never take away sins. They simply covered sins. Okay, that's why they had to be performed year after year. That's why the high priest had to go into the Holy of Holies on what we're calling a Day of Atonement and do it all over again. And even the book of Hebrews tells us in Hebrews 10, verse 4, that it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. And it tells us in Hebrews 10:1 that the law was only a shadow of the good things that are coming, not the realities themselves. Okay, so again, without getting into all of the teaching from last fall, it's very clear that the Old Testament points to the Messiah. Okay, Jesus himself made this very clear. We looked at it on another day. We looked at Luke 24, where Jesus was walking with the two men on the road to Emmaus, and he explained to them how the Old Testament scriptures were about him. Likewise, later in Luke 24, he explained to his disciples that the entire Old Testament was about him. He told them everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms. Okay, so likewise, getting to the feasts. The feasts that are described again in Leviticus chapter 23, Numbers chapters 28 and 29, and Deuteronomy 16 foreshadowed Jesus the Messiah. To be more specific, these feasts provided the Israelites with a picture of the Messiah. They were visual aids that God provided in the roughly 1,500 years leading up to the birth of Jesus, to his incarnation, so that the Jewish people would clearly recognize Jesus as the Messiah. I say these are visual aids. We have a saying here, I don't know if this translates across different languages or different cultures, but we have a saying that a picture is worth 1,000 words. Okay, and I think everybody probably understands what that means. If you give someone a picture, that can just illuminate things, that can clear things up more expeditiously, more clearly than many, many words. If you show someone a picture, oftentimes that brings a greater understanding. So that's what these feasts were. They pictured or portrayed Jesus. And again, as I've already said, we will see that these feasts, Jesus is actually the personal embodiment or spiritual reality of each of these feasts. He's the ultimate fulfillment of each of these 7 feasts. And again, Jesus has already literally fulfilled the spring feasts. He will fulfill the fall feasts upon his second coming. Beyond that, each and every one of these 7 feasts is a picture of something that Jesus did during his time on earth or is going to do upon his return. Just jumping ahead a little bit, the seventh and final feast is the Feast of Tabernacles. This feast was to be celebrated at the end of the Israelites' agricultural season. It was a time of great rejoicing, great celebration. It was a time when the Jewish people could rest from their harvest labors. It was a time when they could come together and just celebrate all that God had done for them. Prophetically speaking, the Feast of Tabernacles points to the ultimate rest that we will all enjoy in God's presence for all eternity in the new heaven and the new earth. So just to summarize, hopefully what I've said up to this point, taken as a whole, meaning when you look at the 7 feasts in their entirety, these form a complete picture of the person and work of the Messiah. They also, again, we'll get into this in a future lesson, they also represent steps that we can take as, again, 21st century Christians to walk, and there's 3 key words here, to walk in the peace, the power, and the rest of Jesus. We'll talk much more about these in lessons to come, but those are 3 key words. Studying these feasts can teach us to walk in the peace, the power, and the rest of Jesus. So getting back to the feasts specifically, I think many people are surprised to learn that Jesus actually referred to these feasts in the very first chapter of the Bible. I wanted to read from Genesis chapter 1, and it's verse 14. Okay, this is during the creation specifically. This is going to be the 4th day of creation. And I just wanted to read Genesis 1:14. And God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs," and here's the key phrase, "to mark seasons." Okay, we want to focus on the word seasons, and I'll explain more in just a second. Seasons and days and years. I wanted to focus on the word that's translated into English as seasons and point out that in our understanding, for most of us, when we hear the word seasons, we think of the seasons of the year. Okay, we think of spring, summer, fall, or autumn, or winter. Okay, when someone talks about seasons, that's typically our understanding of it. However, in the Bible, the Hebrew word that is translated into English as season is actually moed. It's M-O-E-D. Okay, that's how it's transliterated, moed. Okay, M-O-E-D. It does not refer to the seasons of the year as we think of the seasons. Moed actually means, if you look it up in the Hebrew, it means a fixed, appointed time or season or place where God would meet with his people. It refers to God's appointed biblical holy days. Specifically, if you look up moed, like if you have the Strong's Concordance or something where you can look up the meaning of Hebrew words, it actually means a holy festival or feast days when the people would have a holy encounter with the living God. Okay, so that's what seasons is referring to. It's the same word that's used in Leviticus 23, verse 2, that I recited at the very beginning of today's teaching, where God says, "These are my appointed feasts, the feasts of the Lord." The same word is used for feasts, meaning the Hebrew word moed, M-O-E-D. The same word is used in Leviticus 23 for feasts as is used for the word seasons in Genesis 1:14. Okay, so it's a feast. Now, to go a little deeper on this, when we, just as when we hear the word seasons, we think of, the calendar, fall, spring, summer, winter. Likewise, I think when most people hear the word feasts, they associate that with food, and rightly so. When we think of someone going to a feast, we think that people are going to eat. They're going to maybe gorge themselves with food, enjoy a culinary experience, and that's certainly one meaning of it. However, I think what that is translated into is many people mistakenly think that these biblical feasts were times that the Jewish people got together to eat, and that was not the primary reason or even a reason for these holy days. Again, what these were designed to do, these were special times throughout the year that God designed and appointed for the Israelites to have a special encounter with them, and for them to have a special encounter with God. Again, going a little deeper on this, I want to go back to Leviticus 23:2, where God said, "These are my appointed feasts, the appointed feasts of the Lord, which you are to proclaim as sacred assemblies." I wanted to focus on those two words, sacred assemblies. Some translations may refer to this as holy convocations. Okay. I also wanted to look at the Hebrew word for holy convocations or sacred assemblies. The Hebrew word there, again, transliterated into English, is mikrah. Mikrah. It's M-I-K-R-A-H. M-I-K-R-A-H. Mikrah actually means a rehearsal. Okay, you can think of this in terms of like a drama, like a dramatic production or a theatrical production. We're, I think, all familiar with dress rehearsals. Okay, like if you're going to be in a theatrical production, in the days, weeks, maybe even months leading up to that production, you will be involved in what are known as dress rehearsals. In other words, you'll be acting out or practicing what you'll be doing during the actual production. And so that's what sacred assemblies refers to. It's mikra. To be more specific, what these feasts were, this is where the Jews would actually act out through these feasts or through these festivals a dress rehearsal of sorts for the purpose of revealing the Messiah and learning the overall redemptive and prophetic plan of God. In other words, for a period of roughly 1,500 years, okay, that would be the time between when God, we don't know the exact date, but the time when God led the Hebrews, the Israelites, out of Egypt, when he delivered them from bondage, from slavery, up until the time Jesus, came to the earth in the form of man. For roughly 1,500 years, the Jews performed a drama of redemption as a picture pointing them to the person of Jesus, the Messiah. Okay, going a little deeper, I'll go for maybe another 5 or so minutes. I know I don't want to take up too much time, but God established these appointed feasts, or this moed, M-O-E-D, on the Jewish calendar to be celebrated at a certain time and in a certain sequence. Okay, so every year these feasts had to be performed in sequence, meaning Passover, unleavened bread, first fruits, Pentecost, trumpets, atonement, tabernacles, year in and year out. So again, the more we study the Bible, the more we see that everything is put in there in a certain sequence. Nothing's random, nothing's out of order, nothing is misplaced at all. God arranged these biblical feasts in such an order that Jesus would fulfill them, as I've already mentioned, that he would fulfill them in his own life and ministry on the exact dates that the Jews had been celebrating them for 1,500 years. Okay, so the question becomes, how has Jesus fulfilled these feasts, and how will he fulfill these feasts? And that's what we're going to talk about in the remaining sessions in the year to come. However, just as a preview, just looking ahead, I'll go through the 7 feasts, and what I'm about to list here isn't exhaustive. in the sense that there are more ways that Jesus has fulfilled these feasts, but just to get our minds thinking ahead of what's to come in future teachings. As far as Passover is concerned, Jesus fulfilled this in his death and crucifixion. Okay, very clear that Jesus was crucified on Passover. Unleavened bread. Okay, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Jesus celebrated or fulfilled this upon his burial. First fruits. Jesus fulfilled this feast or this day upon his resurrection. Pentecost. This was when Jesus, again, was glorified and exalted to the throne of God. And we all know when he sent the Holy Spirit to indwell in us. Trumpets. Again, Jesus has fulfilled all of these in one sense, but trumpets, atonement, tabernacles, these are still to come upon his second return. Trumpets he'll fulfill upon his return. I think it's clear that when Jesus returns, that will be accompanied by the sound of trumpets. Atonement, okay, the Day of Atonement. This was the one day of the year when the high priest was allowed to go into the most holy place where the Ark of the Covenant was, and the mercy seat or atonement cover. Jesus has fulfilled this when he went into the heavenly Holy of Holies with his own blood shed for the forgiveness of sins. But he'll also fulfill this when he returns to judge the world. And finally, as I've already mentioned, the Feast of Tabernacles. This will have its ultimate fulfillment. Again, we'll go much more into detail on all of these in the lessons to come, but this will have its ultimate fulfillment when we experience the ultimate rest in our souls in the new heaven and the new earth. So that's the teaching for today. The next teaching, I would like to get a little bit more into how the feasts represent steps in our lives that we can take insofar as our walk with the Lord is concerned, and insofar as our spiritual maturity is concerned. I would also like, and I hope you don't find this boring. I happen to find it fascinating. I would like to look a little bit at the Jewish calendar, meaning the biblical calendar, how that differs from our calendar, and again, just to see that in a deeper, more personal way, how each of these feasts represent or give us a very clear picture of our Messiah. And then again, in the lessons to come, I would like to take each of the 7 feasts and really do kind of a deep dive, really kind of unpack each of these feasts, because there's so much more to each of these feasts. I mean, I think we could study these for the rest of our lives here on this earth and still not exhaust, just like the Bible as a whole, still not exhaust everything that's to be gleaned from these feasts. But I hope you have found this interesting. I had never really studied the feasts until probably about 4 years ago. But once I started studying them, I just became fascinated with them when I saw literally how Jesus is the ultimate personal embodiment and spiritual reality of each of the 7 feasts. And again, it's just a reminder that the word is inexhaustible. Okay, we trust that the word is inerrant, it's infallible, and it's inexhaustible. We could study, that's the beautiful thing about Scripture. Beautiful thing about the gospel is that it's simple enough that a child can understand, yes, yet it's complex and deep enough that we'll never plumb to the depths of it. There's always more to be learned, always more to be gleaned. And we can learn so much from one another as we all study the Scriptures. I still have a lot to learn about the feasts and indeed about the Bible, but I always enjoy hearing from others as well, because, we each read it with obviously a different set of eyes and a new perspective. And so that's a little bit about what's to come. And I hope that you have found this to be interesting and that it has kind of whetted your appetite for coming back for future lessons. I expect this series of lessons to run most of 2026. That's how detailed these feasts are. And I think that represents how much knowledge and wisdom and insight and discernment we can glean and put into practice in our own lives. And hopefully, as we love and interact and minister to others as well, there's just so much to be learned. So thank you. That's my time. I know I may have gone over time, but thank you for your indulgence. And I will say my wife is also here. I'm gonna move over to the couch here in just a minute, and she'll be on with me. She's been listening in to all of this, and we would love to just pray with you, answer any questions you have, or anything that we can do to minister to you, or if you have a special word of encouragement or blessing or anything for us in this new year of 2026, we would appreciate that. So thank you.